thank Belinda and Cornell for organizing this with me, for Nancy, just using first names. Everyone's name is in the program you can find online. The Chancellor for helping put this together, and to folks that are here to listen and participate, and to our great speakers. Thank you all. So real quick, when I put together this proposal with Belinda and Cornell, I don't really work on immigration in terms of my own research, and the focus of the seminar is on immigration. So I tried to think about a seminar that ties in with my own work to some extent, which is in Brazil. It occurred to me that kind of having a conversation about the complexity of politics that cross borders in Brazilian communities and in Indian communities, and kind of having a dialogue there, where these complex cross-border politics are, really important aspects of the local scene here, would be something really interesting and a unique kind of conversation, which I don't think has really happened anywhere. So I'm looking forward to today's conversation. I won't say any more preparatory remarks. I will just introduce our awesome speakers for this first panel, which is the global rights across borders. And first speaker, I have a print small, I got to put on my reading glasses. It's going to be Audrey Truschke, who is a faculty member in the history department here at Rutgers-Newark. She's an associate professor of South Asian history here. She's the author of 3 books: Culture of Encounters, Sanskrit at the Mughal Court, 2016. I should have figured out these pronunciations beforehand. Aurangzeb, 2017. Forgive me for errors in my pronunciation. The Brazilian titles in Portuguese would be easy for me. The Language of History, Sanskrit Narratives of Indo-Muslim Rule, 2021. She's currently the recipient of the National Endowment of Humanities Public Scholars Grant to write her next book, a single-volume history of India from the Indus Valley Civilization until the present day, which is under contract with Princeton University Press. I also happen to know that she's on sabbatical this semester, so thanks for showing up. And when Audrey isn't writing about Mughal, Sanskrit texts, or Hindu-Muslim interactions, she's often calling attention to abuses of history and human rights in contemporary South Asia. Her other frequent activities include condemning sexism and Islamophobia, reading, and spending time with her family. And I'm just going to introduce all 3 speakers right now, and then the 3 of them will speak, and then we'll open up for conversation. Next up is Vânia Penha-Lopes of Bloomfield College. Vânia Penha-Lopes is professor of sociology at Bloomfield, co-chair of the Brazil seminar at Columbia University, and member of the Laboratório de Estudos Negros at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. She's a research fellow at the Washington Brazil office and former member of the executive committee of the Brazilian Studies Association, BRAS. A native of Rio de Janeiro, Dr. Penha-Lopes graduated with honors from the Federal University of Rio with a bachelor's degree in social sciences, and from New York University with a master's degree in anthropology and PhD in sociology in 1999. She's the author of the presidential elections of Trump and Bolsonaro, Whiteness and Nation, Racismo lá e cá, 60 Crônicas, Confronting Affirmative Action, University Quota Students and the Quest for Racial Justice, Pioneiros Pochistas na Universidade Brasileira, and co-editor of Religiosidade de Performance, Geólogos Contemporâneos. On social media, she can be found at www.vaniapenhalopes.com, and her other assorted hashtags or whatever handles you call them are here. You can find them in the program. And then finally, for this first panel, we'll have Isabela Kalil of the University of São Paulo. Isabela Kalil has a PhD in anthropology from the University of São Paulo. She's a professor at the São Paulo School of Sociology and Political Science and coordinator of the the Center for Urban Ethnography at the same institution. Prior to joining that institution, she was a visiting scholar at Columbia University in the Department of Anthropology. And I see that her many wonderful publications aren't listed here, but they're great and worth checking out. Especially, she's been very, very important in kind of developing our understanding of Bolsonarismo, the support for Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. So that's it. That's my introduction. Once again, thank you all so much for being here. And I'll now give the floor to Audrey.
Okay. Well, while it's coming, welcome everyone. It's truly my pleasure to be here today in my home academic environment. Right? So it's very comfortable for me. And it's going. It's coming. Okay. Do you want me to wait or? Okay. So we're just gonna kill time. Let's see. So I will be presenting today at some future moment, hopefully in the next few moments. Not from my current research project on my current book, but rather from a secondary research project in which I've been engaged for close to 2 years now, that looks at the US-based Hindu rights. Okay, I am trained as a pre-modernist, and that remains the core of my work. But I've also been subjected to Hindu nationalist attacks for around 6-7 years now. And a long time ago, when they first started, I decided to turn it into a research project so that it's not all wasted time. So that's where my interest in modernity comes from. People, it's gonna be bad if I actually go into jokes or, I can't do that really. Now I'm thinking of my kids who are still very young. My 6-year-old is obsessed with knock-knock jokes. She got a book of knock-knock jokes. I have no idea where this book came from, but I hate this book. Am I with you? All right, folks, should I just roll on? We're just gonna roll on. All right, folks, thanks for sticking with me. And despite my very friendly, calm, casual demeanor, right? You take the girl out of the Midwest, but not the Midwest out of the girl. I'm going to start on a somewhat negative note. So 2 months ago, in August of 2022, Hindu nationalists paraded a bulldozer down the streets of Edison, New Jersey. And they did this as a hate symbol. The bulldozer is widely used at present in India, which is under the rule of a far-right nationalist party, to illegally destroy the houses of Indian Muslims and generally terrorize this minority community. Okay, Muslims are around 14% of the current Indian population. For those who follow Indian politics, the bulldozer is as potent a hate symbol as a burning cross or a Nazi swastika. But this particular bulldozer, it wasn't in India, and it wasn't on the streets of Bombay, it was in New Jersey on the streets of Edison, and context here matters. Many New Jersey politicians were present at this parade, and those not of South Asian descent generally did not recognize the intolerant meaning of the bulldozer. In this case, Hindu nationalists, who are a politically defined group who support the far-right ideology that we sometimes call Hindutva, they were banking on the ignorance of most Americans in order to get away with intimidating a minority community in broad daylight. Now, in this case, it didn't work. Okay, the pushback to the bulldozer incident was fairly fierce, and it is ongoing, but it could have worked. And I open with this example as a jumping off point for us to think about how Hindu nationalists have adapted their lexicons, their tactics, and even their goals to some degree in order to operate in the United States. And what I really want to discuss today are a more insidious feature of these shifts, namely Hindutva intersections with white supremacy. So my core argument is that we really must think about Hindu and white supremacy in tandem when talking about the American context. Specifically, we see that Hindu nationalists in the United States promote some of the broad goals of white supremacy, and they also have their own actions and activities shaped by white supremacy. So in making this set of arguments, I'm building on the scholarship of many others, including Prema Kurian, who was here today, we'll hear from her later, Bijou Matthews, Vijay Prashant, and many others, who have talked about American Hindutva, or Yankee Hindutva, over the last couple of decades. Now, interesting. As my data set, I'm going to be using as my data for this particular analysis today, Hindu nationalist attacks on academics in North America, which have been occurring for close to 30 years. Now, I and many colleagues often discuss these attacks as grave threats to academic freedom. They are that. Here, I'm focusing on something else, right? And I really want to draw out what insights they can provide into the dark nexus between Hindu and white supremacies. Now, these attacks have been collated online by a group called the South Asia Scholar Activist Collective, or SASIC for short, okay, and that timeline is available on the internet. I am a member of that collective, and I'm very proud to have contributed to this piece of collective scholarship and activism. So we start in the 1990s. That's when Hindu nationalist attacks on North American-based academics began. Okay, and the initial wave of attacks focused really on a handful of white scholars. All right? Consider that the earliest 6 attacks that are documented by SASIC's timeline, in those 6 attacks, all but one focused on a white scholar. Generally, the Hindu right argument was that the scholar in question had misinterpreted Hinduism or Sanskrit's text because of their identity. And let me point out a couple of things about this initial wave of assaults. The first is that the complaints constituted a depressing laundry list of retrograde right-wing stances, including heteronormativity, Victorian prudishness, and patriarchy. So, for example, members of the Hindu right objected to frank discussions of sexuality in Indian texts, okay, such as in a lovely book, which would have been displayed, that addresses homoerotic discourse in the writings of a 19th century Hindu spiritual leader. Hindu nationalists also condemned another book by Paul Courtwright, which mentions phallic imagery in Hindu traditions. Okay, phallic imagery is a fairly basic and recurrent trend in pre-modern Hinduism. In general, sexuality is celebrated in early Hindu texts and temples. It only becomes a bad thing following modern-day prejudices. A third example is that following patriarchal logic, Hindu nationalists often attacked women with special vehemence and tried to demean them. So, all right. There's Bulldozer. All right, for the rest of it, we'll just go ahead. So, for example, okay, my patriarchy example, they referred to Dr. Wendy Doniger by her first name, eschewing her proper title of doctor or professor. This is a tactic that very much persists today in Hindutva attacks on female scholars. Now, many of the early attacks were also characterized by a sort of xenophobic reifying of insiders versus outsiders that rejected academic knowledge and embraced instead a sort of crude racial superiority. Now, key to understanding this is as follows. In the Hindutva worldview, Hindus constitute a race. This is true for nobody else on the face of the earth, okay? But Hindu nationalists are fairly clear on this. So Hindus are a race for them, and they possess superiority over others, especially regarding knowledge of Hinduism. Now, this logic invalidates education. It undermines the very value of the humanities, I would argue, because it declares that knowledge is found in your blood rather than in your training. It also draws fairly crudely on theories of racial superiority that are foundational to white supremacy, even while inverting the hierarchy. But Hindu nationalists do not always invert a racial hierarchy, as we'll see. So as time went on, going into the early aughts, right, 2000 to 2010, Hindu right attacks on the North American Academy expanded, and they soon began to also target scholars of color, especially academics of South Asian descent, including many Hindus. Now, in such cases, the outsider logic that earlier Hindu right attacks had deployed, it didn't work so well. And so what the Hindu right began to do was deploy two key tactics of white supremacy to position scholars of color within a Hindu nationalist narrative. They centered white viewpoints and they denied agency to people of color. One place to see both of these at work is in language. So relatively early on, a man, his name is Mr. Malhotra, he was one of the main early attackers of scholars in North America. He popularized the term sepoy. Now, sepoy is a real word. Okay? Historically, it's an Indian soldier who fought for British colonialists. But Mr. Malhotra deployed sepoy as a slur to refer to South Asian descent scholars whose views did not bow to Hindutva. The relevance of the term sepoy in those contexts trades on denying agency to scholars of color, depicting them as only following the orders of white masters, who in this Hindutva vision are always running the show. So you can see this in these tweets, which span several years. Each one attacks a scholar of color as a quote sepoy, accusing them of serving foreign paymasters or Western masters. In the bottom tweet, Mr. Malhotra named a specific white scholar, namely Dr. Sheldon Pollock, who has nothing to do with Pankaj Mishra, except that Malhotra can put the two in a crude racialized hierarchy of agency and even control. Now, in the last decade, right, in more recent times, the Hindu right has overwhelmingly targeted scholars of South Asian descent in the North American Academy. And this is a screenshot taken from the timeline put together by the South Asia Scholar Activist Collective, to which I referred. I realize you can't read all of it, and that's fine. I'm showing it to you just to demonstrate that these are the 5 most recent attacks documented by SASIC, all but one focused on scholars of color, including many Hindus. Now, in a wave of attacks in 2021, okay, and there are 30 separate attacks, as you can see here, 2 of which independently lasted for months. Hinduphobia was the trending term for Hindu right grievances against diverse faculty. Many scholars have criticized the term Hinduphobia as akin to anti-white racism. I want to point out something a little different, namely that the Hindu right frequently dubs Hindus as Hinduphobic. This makes sense within a constricting nativism, whereby most Hindus, the Hindu right says, are actually not real Hindus. So who are the real Hindus left in the Hindutva worldview? Well, as one would expect for a right-wing ideology, the Hindutva vision of who's a real Hindu, who can really speak for Hinduism, tends to drag up really old both privileges and prejudices. Most often, they identify upper caste men as the proper spokespersons. Now, the Hindutva turn to attacking scholars of color remains consistent with Hindutva's centering of white agency. And let me give you an example. Last year, there was an academic conference titled Dismantling Global Hindutva. It was an academic conference like any other. It was not all that noteworthy, except that it was the target of the most robust Hindu nationalist attack on academic freedom in the United States to date. More than 50 universities received collectively millions of emails objecting to the conference. That is not an exaggeration. Dozens of scholars were negatively impacted. Many received death threats. Now, in an analysis of the hate, scholars from Columbia University showed that my name was the single most common in Hindu nationalist tweets about the conference. I did not speak at this conference, and I did not organize it either. I actually had nothing to do with it. I merely attended. The logic of white supremacy embraced by Hindutva, specifically the idea that a white person must always be at the helm somehow, partly explains why I occupied such a focal point in Hindutva imagination and anxiety about this academic event. In reality, this conference was organized and put on by dozens of scholars of color. Now, as scholars of South Asian descent have become the poster children targeted by the Hindu right, we see the advancement of yet another goal of white supremacy, namely cutting back on diversity in the academy. I have wondered if the Hindu right recognizes their anti-diversity bias as such, that again and again, especially in the last 10 to 15 years, they are trying to get scholars of color fired and reprimanded. And I don't know if the Hindu right sees it that way. But I take a page here from the philosopher Dr. Kate Mann, who has pointed out regarding misogyny that we're generally in a better position to focus on the impacts on victims rather than trying to discern the motivations and internal thought processes of perpetrators. And so regarding the internal reasons or narratives of the Hindu right, regardless of what those might be, the results of the academy, in point of fact, cut against diversity initiatives, and they contribute to the rise of anti-Asian hate in the US at present as well. Now these days, solidarity, especially with historically and between historically oppressed communities, is one of the biggest threats to Hinduism groups in the United States. And in fact, we see a lot of solidarity. Members of all South Asian religious communities, including many Hindus, stand against Hindutva ideology. In the academy and activist circles, there's been quite a bit of work building up solidarities with Black American communities, especially led by Dalits, a historically oppressed group who are at the bottom of India's caste system. Now, the solidarity has a lot of goals and sort of facets, but a lot of it right now has focused on pushing for protections against caste-based discrimination at colleges and at universities. This is pitched at different points as both a civil rights issue and a labor issue, and it's both. From a Hindutva viewpoint, there are a couple of distinct prejudices at play here. Hindu nationalists often display casteist bigotry against Dalits, and they also often partake in anti-Black racism. And all of that comes together in what I would call pro-caste activism by the Hindu right, which is a growing issue for them. In the past month alone, 2 separate lawsuits have been filed by Hindu right individuals and groups trying to prevent caste-based civil rights protections in California. So looking back over nearly 30 years of Hindu right attacks on the North American Academy, more recent waves help us analyze the earlier attacks with greater clarity and vice versa. The initial assaults were never about unwhitening an academic discipline in the sense that Charles Mills used that term, because the intention was never to introduce a diversity of persons or viewpoints. Instead, the Hindu rights goals are fairly consistently hegemony and homogeneity. Okay? Hindutva itself as an ideology has not fundamentally changed in the last century. But in that period of time, it has made a home on American soil, where champions of Hindutva have adopted white supremacist tactics. Hindu nationalists center white voices, they deny agency to scholars of color, and they try to reduce diversity in the North American Academy. And let me end by just saying something about the close to 3 decades of Hindutva assaults on academics collectively. Together, as a whole, the attacks constitute powerful evidence for a Hindutva focus on undermining academic freedom, a key agenda item among right-wing groups in America more broadly, such as white nationalists and the Koch network. It seems that no matter what part of the global right we choose to analyze, one thing that they all seem to share is a strong fear of producing knowledge, including about their own malicious activities. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Audrey. Next up, we have Vânia Penha-Lopes.
Morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. So I'm going to talk about Bolsonaristas in the United States in 2018 and 2022. So as I prepared for this presentation, I thought of the fact that in Brazil, we create words to refer to people who fit into certain categories. For example, university quota students and the quotas are cotas in Portuguese, are called cotistas. And I'm mentioning this because one time I gave a talk and at a university and said, well, isn't that pejorative? It's like, no, we create these terms. People confined to wheelchairs, cadeira de rodas, are called cadeirantes. And those who follow Bolsonaro, the current president of Brazil, are called Bolsonaristas. And that is not pejorative. There are plenty of pejorative terms to refer to them, but that's not one of them. So that's the one I'm going to use. So I'll begin by defining Bolsonarismo and then talk about Bolsonaristas per se. According to Brazilian social scientist Andrei Cordeiro Ferreira, Bolsonarismo is the product of the political crisis that started in 2013 with the Come to the Streets movement, followed by President Dilma Rousseff's tight re-election in 2014. He continues, and that's my translation. Bolsonarismo is a fusion of Brazilian conservative liberalism with conservative neoliberalism, understood as less state intervention in the economy and dismissal of policies that address minority rights, something that characterized progressive neoliberalism. He lists six major components of Bolsonarismo. One, an ultra-liberal economic politics of privatization and extraction of natural resources. Two, the reconstruction of a patriarchal and racist supremacy, destroying all diversity programs. Three, an expansion of large land ownership as opposed to land reform. Four, promotion of a unilateral international participation, which totally caters to U.S. interests. Five, centralization of state power in the hands of the executive branch by increasing repression and social control as a way of containing direct class struggle. And finally, strategy of attacking the Workers' Party, heretofore PT, hereafter PT, whose main figure is Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, Bolsonaro's opponent in 2018 until he was arrested and the front runner in the current presidential elections. Manuel Loff, Portuguese historian, concludes that, it's a quote, Bolsonarismo is the most complete and most shameless version of the far right, in that it follows the argument that there is a Marxist cultural dictatorship that is disseminated by public schools and that it needs to be quelled. In fact, Bolsonaro's 2018 campaign had a three-pronged agenda that clearly illustrated the above descriptions: the economy, education, and public safety. He named his platform the Prosperity Way, a way that would be quote-unquote decent, different from all that has thrown us in an ethical, moral, and fiscal crisis. A government without quid pro quo, without spurious agreements, a government formed by persons who are committed to Brazil and to Brazilians. The platform claimed PT had left Brazil in an economic deficit that could only be eliminated by a democratic liberal economic plan with less state control. It also planned to lower the number of ministries in order to tend to the legitimate interests of the nation, thus eradicating corruption. Those promises confirmed his alignment with the claims that communism was a threat spearheaded by PT and symbolized by its red flag, an idea that had gained momentum during the campaign for Rousseff's impeachment in 2016. Besides the economy, Bolsonaro's campaign targeted education and public safety. For Bolsonaro, it was necessary to rid Brazilian education of the influence of Paulo Freire's ideas. As most of us know, Paulo Freire was a Brazilian historian and philosopher of education who develops the pedagogy of the oppressed, a critical system in which learning is dialogical and engaged with one's cultural and economic circumstances. His work was considered subversive by the military regime in power from 1964 to 1985, which led to his imprisonment in 1964 and exile from 64 to 79. Freire is internationally known as an authority in innovative pedagogy. Like the military in power during the dictatorship, Bolsonaro equates Freire's body of work with communism. In fact, in August of 2018, he vowed to quote-unquote, go in with a flamethrower in the Ministry of Education and Culture in order to kick Paulo Freire out of there. His plan was to create a school without parties, that is, an educational system free of the influence of leftist ideas from grade school to the university level. Implicit is the idea that no parties means only the far right. It is worth mentioning that Bolsonaro has been consistently against university expansion and university quotas. While the former, there was a widespread policy during the 15 years in government. During President Lula's 2 tenures, the number of university students grew from nearly 4 million to close to 6 million. Most of them went to private universities made affordable by scholarships and low-interest loans. Another way Bolsonaro attacked Brazilian education during his campaign was to claim it promoted a gay lifestyle. Especially through social media, Bolsonaro's camp was successful in convincing plenty of voters that Fernando Haddad, the PT candidate, had created and adopted a gay kit to combat homophobia and turn school children into homosexuals during his tenure as mayor of the city of São Paulo. As early as 2011, Bolsonaro claimed there was a gay conspiracy supported by the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Health, and the Supreme Court. As for public safety, it is indeed a major concern in Brazil, where it keeps increasing. By 2018, public safety had become the priority issue for voters. Preoccupation with widespread violence was a major reason for the growth of Bolsonaro's popularity among voters over and above the other candidates' platforms. For Moura and Covelini, who published the first book on the 2018 results, the fact that Bolsonaro lacked a clear plan to foment public safety was less important than his willingness to face criminal violence with equal force, characterized by his hand gestures simulating a gun. Interestingly enough, although he declared he would govern without quid pro quo, he approached violence as an eye for an eye. The thing is, in Brazil, class inequality and racist stereotypes interact to make Blacks and the poor the poster children of violence and the main threat to public safety. Brazil is the country that kills the largest number of Blacks in the world, especially young Black men. Bolsonaro is also notoriously misogynist, especially against feminists. This year, he attacked a woman journalist, Vera Magalhães, during a presidential debate, accusing her of being obsessed with him and ashamed for Brazilian journalism. Yet, lately, he has been trying to convince people that he is pro-women because he has a daughter and wants her to thrive. Finally, although Bolsonaro claims he is not a racist because he wants to save the Black man's life, he sounds unconvincing when he gives no importance to Black and Indigenous rights, claiming that we are all the same, and when he said in 2017 that the minorities must bow to the majority. The other aspect of Bolsonarism is the evangelical connection. There's a clear synergy between Bolsonaro's discourse about education, homosexuality, women, and minorities, and his appeal to evangelicals. According to Brazilian sociologist Isabela, Bolsonaro's campaign appealed to a moralization of custom, that is, a rejection of the ideology of gender, of feminism, and of abortionist engagements, all of which it saw as the products of years of a leftist government. For instance, against the prominence of so-called feminazi bitches, that is, feminists, the evangelical discourse proposes the princess and the queen of the home, Rainha do Lar. For years, evangelical politicians have promoted the gay cure, that is a bill approved in the state of São Paulo, that overrules the decision of the Federal Council of Psychology to refrain from engaging in projects that see homosexuality as a disease that needs to be treated. Evangelicals constitute about a third of the Brazilian electorate and are sexually and politically conservative. For them, Brazil had become too liberal and immoral, promoting an ideology of gender. As a presidential candidate, Bolsonaro capitalized on that discourse. His motto was Brazil above all and God above everything, which also happens to be a copy of the Nazi model. So, who are Bolsonaristas and how strong is their presence in the United States? Bolsonaristas include far-right sympathizers, evangelicals, conservative women, a large proportion of middle to upper class white men, but also in smaller scale, Afro-Brazilians and some of those who got out of poverty thanks to social policies implemented during the Lula-Dilma governments, according to anthropologists Ben Young and Sean Mitchell. They call Bolsonaro mito, myth. Probably as a result of the ongoing immigration of Brazilians in the century, international voting was significant for the final results of 2018. Bolsonaro won in most of Europe and Asia, but his most impressive win was in the United States, where the majority of the expatriate Brazilians who are eligible to vote reside. He won in New York with over 76% of the votes, and in Washington, D.C. with over 69% of the votes. Miami, Florida proved to be Bolsonaro's strongest ground, where he garnered over 90% of the votes. According to Itamaraty, the Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, there were 1,775,000 Brazilians in the United States as of September of last year, and a little over 697,000 Brazilian expatriates were eligible to vote this year. That is an almost 40% drop in comparison with 4 years ago. On October 2nd, after the first round of presidential elections, Bolsonaristas were quick to proclaim his victory in France, Germany, and Portugal, but those results turned out to be fake news. In the United States, these were the results of the first round of elections on October 2nd. Lula won significantly in Chicago and tightly in Los Angeles and Washington, D.C. Bolsonaro won by a landslide in Atlanta, in Boston, which is the second largest Brazilian community in the United States, and garnered close to 60% of the votes in Hartford, Connecticut, and in Houston. Once again, Miami was Bolsonaro's strongest win, close to 3/4 of the votes against a little over a fifth for Lula. Florida is where the majority of Brazilian lives. In sum, Bolsonaro won overwhelmingly in Florida, Georgia, and Texas, which tend to be conservative states that lean toward Trump. And the conclusion is that conservative Brazilians are attracted to those states, just as Bolsonaro is a major fan of Trump. On the other hand, Bolsonaro garnered much fewer votes this year than 4 years ago in New York. In New York, voting comprises New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Bermuda, in addition to New York State. He won by only 3 percentage points, which is surprising given the visible presence of large number of Brazilians clad in the national team's jersey, wrapped in the Brazilian flag, who screamed for Bolsonaro and against Lula in the very long line in New York City. As a matter of fact, they were much more numerous and vociferous this year than in 2018. This week, Defend Democracy in Brazil and U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil sent a letter to the Electoral Supreme Court to denounce the illegal acts that took place on October 2nd in New York City, Miami, and LA, where Bolsonaristas openly campaigned for the incumbent president, intimidated voters, and did carreatas. Those are parades of cars covered with a Brazilian flag and loudspeakers screaming his name and playing his jingle, an appropriation of baile de favela, favela's party. That's a funky carioca, a musical genre created in the Rio favelas and inspired by hip hop. In New York City, I saw the crowd chant Lula ladrão, Lula is a thief. In Orlando, a case of physical violence was reported. Bolsonaristas in the United States started preparing for that at least a month earlier. To celebrate the 200th anniversary of Brazil's independence on September 7th this year, they took advantage of the observance of Labor Day in the United States on September 5th and congregated in Times Square, New York, in Boston, Orlando, and Dallas. How do you know they were Bolsonaristas? They were wearing the colors of the Brazilian flag and carrying our flag as they are known to do. According to journalist Thiago Amancio, Bolsonaro himself at one point addressed the crowd via video conference. He said, the direct quote, "Those of you who are outside of Brazil, as a rule, have a more accurate and realistic view of what happens in our country, why you left the country, and what you want for the country." I also found a video on YouTube of Bolsonaristas gathered in an unnamed auditorium in the United States singing the U.S. national anthem on September 8th. This from people who have appropriated all of our national symbols and who purport to love our nation more than those who do not fit their niche, not follow their niche. Among the Bolsonarista crowd in New York, when I went to vote, I could see Brazilians of every hue, age, and gender. Although I have not done primary research on the characteristics of Bolsonaristas in the United States, I tend to believe that they confirm my thesis about the allure of Bolsonarism in 2018, which I explored in my book that came out this year, Presidential Elections of Trump and Bolsonaro, Whiteness in the Nation. And I quote myself, in Brazil, the country with the largest population of African descent outside of Africa and the largest miscegenation rates in the world, the votes for Bolsonaro pointed to the social wish to achieve whiteness and thus eliminate or at least abate the insecurity that comes from belief in the racial inferiority of non-whites. Based on this argument, I suggested that the results of the presidential election reflected a fear by whites that their higher status was being threatened after over a decade of gains by minorities, women, and the poor. Given Brazil's fluid racial classification, it is possible that darker-skinned Brazilians who live in the United States identified as white in their native country and try to pass as such, or perhaps take on a Latina identity in their adopted country. At least in Miami, where the Cuban American population is large and relatively powerful, there is indication that a proportion of Brazilian residents are choosing to self-identify as Latinos. The other possibility is that Brazilian immigrants who vote for Bolsonaro are evangelical, are disenchanted with traditional politicians, bought into the fake news campaign that the Bolsonaro's camp promoted in 2018, and now have experienced some degree of upward mobility, which makes them have disdain for the poor and are in favor of a police state. Those, however, must remain in the realm of hypothesis right now. What seems certain, however, is that a preference for far-right politics are spreading not only in Brazil, but in the United States and the rest of the world. Therefore, while PT elected 26 congresspersons to 2 trans women were elected to Congress for the first time, and this all what leftist party elected 14 persons on October 2nd, its highest number ever. If Lula wins on Sunday, he will have to deal with an adversary Congress that will make it difficult for him to implement his promises, not to mention the many Bolsonaro governors who were elected in the first round. So if Lula wins, that may not prevent Bolsonarism to continue to spread in the country, just as the far right is spreading around the world and threatening democracy. Like most, I anxiously await the results come Sunday. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vânia. And finally, for this first session of the day, we have Isabela Kalil.
Hi, good morning. I'd like to thank Professor John Mitchell for organizing this important panel. And it's a pleasure to be here and also inspiring to hear from you. The topic of my presentation is the anti-democratic turn that has been taking place in Brazil in recent years. And in part, it doesn't seem difficult to connect this topic with this panel, as the current Brazilian president, Jair Bolsonaro, has been called Donald Trump of the tropics. And yes, it is true that Jair Bolsonaro, who is at the end of his administration, has spent the last 4 years imitating Donald Trump. But it's also true that such a comparison presents a series of problems, among them the risk of grossly simplifying the connections between the radical right in Brazil and the United States. And in this case, we can see 2 types of interpretations in the analysis of politics in Brazil. The first, more common here in the United States, is the one that highlights how Bolsonaro follows the Trump's anti-democratic playbook. And in this sense, there would be nothing new in relation to Bolsonaro's actions and projects, which would just be a copy of Trump. This argument was reinforced by the fact that American politics seems to be 2 years ahead. Let me explain. the 2018 Brazilian election looks like the 2016 American election. And in Brazil, we already expected an event similar to the January 6th, if Bolsonaro loses the election to Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. And there are 3 days left, as Vânia said, 3 days left to the election. This is actually this Sunday. And the latest polls show Lula winning with a difference of 0.5 to 4 percentage points. So it's too close. And the second type of explanation, more common in Brazil, is the one that gives little consideration to the transnational phenomenon of democratic erosion and also the relations between Brazil and the United States. In this sense, the type of analysis tends to understand the rise of the radical right in Brazil as something completely new, or even it seeks to understand this phenomenon only from the country's own history, as if we were facing the simple reproduction of the past as the return of the forces of our military dictatorship. What seems to be the most productive path is to find a balance between these two types of interpretations. And that's what I'm going to try to do here. Bolsonaro was elected after the so-called pink time, with the election of left and center-left governments in Latin America, but also in the context of a serious institutional crisis following the impeachment of President Dilma Rousseff and the arrest of Lula, leader of the center-left Workers' Party. The fact that the judge who sentenced Lula to prison later became Bolsonaro's minister reinforced the thesis of a biased prison. Bolsonaro's campaign promises included the encouragement of violence by civilians and widespread access to firearms. His platform explored an anti-corruption agenda that allowed him to attack political parties and left-wing leaders while promoting conservative Christian moral values, materialized in his campaign slogan, God, Fatherland, and Family, inspired by the Brazilian fascism. After being elected, Bolsonaro implemented an anti-democratic project that includes environmental devastation and attacks on the rights of indigenous peoples, intolerance against Afro-Brazilian religion, the reduction of civil rights, the increase of inequalities, and violence in both cities and the countryside, attacks against politics of gender, sexuality, and reproductive health, and the historical revisionism demonstrated by the celebration of the 1964 military coup, in a process that relativized torture and authoritarianism. With the COVID-19 pandemic under the Bolsonaro government, the formulation of public policies was guided by far-right conspiracy theories that at first denied the existence of the virus and then raised doubt about the safety of the vaccine. This process resulted in major delays and numerous refusals by the federal government to effectively combat the disease. And it was during the pandemic that Bolsonaro and Trump came closer. Bolsonaro was already an open fan of Trump. In a meeting between them, Bolsonaro even declared to Trump, I will quote, I love you. Bolsonaro said this in English, so there's no misunderstanding in terms of translation, okay? Bolsonaro said, I love you in English. In the moment, it was so embarrassing that Trump ignored it. Bolsonaro visited Trump here in the US at the beginning of the pandemic. After the meeting, Bolsonaro began to defend the use of chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine and attacked China. And this point is important because the alliance between Trump and Bolsonaro was established through conspiracy theories. In other words, Brazil started to import conspiracy theories from QAnon. And these conspiracy theories were materialized in public policy during the pandemic, and Bolsonaro turned it into official state rhetoric. More recently, Bolsonaro has started copying the Stop the Steal campaign. And since last year, he has been openly saying that the Brazilian election, is a fraud. Just like Trump, he promoted a series of rallies to take the campaign, alleging electoral fraud to the interior of the country. Especially regarding the allegations of fraud in the election, it's important to note that the combination between the transnationalization process of these conspiracy theories and local counter-injustice. I won't be able to address this in detail, but Brazil's voting system is different from the US, which forces Bolsonaristas to make, that ones that support Bolsonaro, to make a series of local adaptations to support these claims. The same is true of anti-immigration positions that has no support among Brazilians, or at least the same support. Due to several historical, racial, cultural, and legal characteristics, the fear of the immigrant, the foreigner, still does not mobilize voters so far. But this does not mean that the us versus them policy is not presented in Bolsonarism. In Brazil, there is no attack against there is an attack against our indigenous populations, who are seen as the foreigner, the other. Likewise, Bolsonaro has already started a process of reaction to the election results, predicting a possible defeat. Recently, he even said that there would only 3 possibilities for him to leave the presidency: victory, and in this case, it would be the transition to the second term, death, or prison. Bolsonaro has made threats saying he would rather not see something like January 6th. But he has imported the figure of the patriot, inspired by Trump's most radical supporters. In 2018, Bolsonaro got the votes necessary to win the elections by appealing to the, in Portuguese, cidadão de bem, the good citizen or upstanding citizen. With the patriot, the president advances in his threat to make a chaos in the electoral process. It's also about mobilizing a more extremist base of supporting, potentially willing the use of violence to achieve political ends. This base does not form an absolute majority of votes, as this we hope, but represents the threat of actions with the use of violence, whether by civilian, paramilitary, or even unsubordinated groups of public security forces or the armed force. With the growing appeal for the participation of protesters considered patriots, those protesters considered weak are losing prominence, relevance, and prestige within Bolsonaro movement and in these groups. On the other hand, only those who have a greater skill with the use of force and violence, whether rhetorical or physical, gain prominence. As such, the ones that against the Brazilian Supreme Court as examples to be followed by the protesters. They march they march to the Supreme Court in order to close the Supreme Court or something like that, or invade the Supreme Court. And the leaders of these acts become more prestigious each time they advance in their strategic extremism against democratic institutions. These events serve as an argument to supporters that insurgency is the only possible alternative to politics, and in turn, they are encouraged by the most radicals to test the symbolical and empirical limits of democracy. In this scenario, institutions, political parties, the press, and the international politicians are seen as enemies and would be contained. In other words, these actions are two laboratories of anti-democratic violence where tactics, strategies, discourses, devices, categories, agenda, leaderships, forms of communications are tested. As a consequence, we are witnessing threats of actions that can lead to turmoil in the electoral process and weakening the democratic institutions and discouraging political participation via votes by voters. Although this is not an exclusively Brazilian phenomenon, it's about considering disinformation, fake news, conspiracy theories, and episodes of violence or insurgency as topics that are political important and represents a risk not just for the electoral process, but the democracy. Thank you.
So thank you so much to the three wonderful panelists. That was fantastic. We have some time for questions. So I think just, please raise your hand, and Elian has a microphone. Let's open it up for discussion.
Thank you to all the panelists. I appreciate all the talks. My question is for Dr. Truschke. You mentioned that you began this project on internationalism and connections to America about 2 years ago, I think. But that the attacks on you began about 6 or 7 years ago, if I recall you saying correctly, which is before your RNZ book came out, I believe. I was wondering what instigated those attacks and what instigated you getting involved in talking about the international issue originally.
Hello. Sure, happy to answer that. So, originally what instigated the first wave of attacks against me was in late 2015. It all started, I was a postdoc at Stanford. Stanford University's press office did like a nice puff piece about me. I had like my first book coming out. That prompted the Hindu, which is a newspaper, an English media newspaper in India, to ask me for an interview. And I said I was caught off guard when it was the last time that ever happened actually publicly. And because I said all these things in this interview about one pre-modern Indian king that I thought were like edgy, controversial. No one cared. Still no one cares. And I said 2 sentences on another pre-modern Indian king, Aurangzeb, for those who know that name, that were completely non-controversial from a historian's perspective. There's not an academic alive that would disagree with those 2 sentences, and I felt like the world exploded back at me. And that was my first brush with hate now. To the extent that I did have agency in some of this, I didn't walk away. Right, I was a young scholar. I didn't have a tenure-track job yet. I was trying to build my social media presence, so I kept doing that. And so I thought, this is an opportunity to communicate information and knowledge to a public that has, not obviously followed the last 20 to 30 years of scholarly thinking on this particular figure. And so I wrote the Aurangzeb book later, and things sort of snowballed from that.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Very terrific. I have a question for Penha-Lopes and Dr. About kind of Brazilian election. As you both noted, it seems like a replay of kind of 22 American election where polls are showing very big leads for Lula, even the very distinct possibility of winning the election in the first round. And then we have much closer election than you have, and the far right in a lot of these governor races, right? My question has to do with, there was kind of realignment. We don't know if that political realignment in the United States is permanent, right? Which has, followed a global trend of sort of what political scientists are calling educational polarization. I think really is stand-in for class polarization, is what it seems like, right? And so one of the things we saw in the United States, for example, in the 2020 election was suburban voters, more suburban voters, for example, voting for Biden, and then you had working class and some working class minorities voting peacefully for Trump. And we've seen this phenomenon in other places in Northern Europe and the rest of it. I'm just wondering if Brazilian politics is reflecting that kind of global trend along these kinds of educational and class lines.
Is this? You turned it off. You clicked it off. Yeah. Just turn it back up.
Well, thank you for your question.
Sorry if I butchered your name. If I
Oh,
pronounced your name
No,
correctly.
no, it is Penha-Lopes.
Okay.
I think I'm gonna answer your question based on what I wrote on my book. I think that, and also based on Sean's book, about the emerging middle class in Brazil. I think both in the United States and in Brazil, there is a history of exclusion, right? Both countries were born not for everybody. And so the whole history of both countries has been for those who have been excluded. And by that, I mean the poor, women, non-whites, indigenous populations over the centuries, trying to be included in the nation, right? Like the most common example that is given is the civil rights movement in the United States, which like we want a piece of the pie. If we are from this country, how come we're not treated as citizens? Because civil rights means citizens' rights, right? So I think that's the way I interpret it. When people say, how can a poor person vote for Bolsonaro, vote for Trump? I think they want to feel included. Whereas, people who are already solidly middle class would not vote for those reasons, right? They feel included already. So I think that that's possible to happen in both countries. It's like, I want to fit in. So, and I think that's why we see that in the United States, we see it in Brazil, and we see it in Europe. Yeah.
Thank you for your question. To answer that, I think we have to look at the difference in terms of how the political parties are organized in both countries. In US, we have majority of the politics divided between Democrats and Republicans. In Brazil, we have over 30 parties. Of course, some parties are not important; they are really small. But historically, we have two parties that had an important role in the democratic process. Partido dos Trabalhadores e PSDB, PT and PSDB. And what happened? We are talking about center left and center right. In the end of the day, the PSB, they like the extreme right and the radical right, they put an end in this center left political party. It's still working, but it's like it's a shame in terms of how they are representing, how they are not really representing any kind of forces against Bolsonaro, anti-democratic project. Anyway, I think that the problem is there's a gap in the radical right is using this gap. I cannot see if we can have any kind of way to put an end in the Bolsonarism if we don't have the center left and the center right together, because it's impossible to have the left doing this. And in the sense, in the end of the day, the voters, they have to choose between PT, the center left party, that historically is really important, but also is involved in corruption cases. And or the radical right. So we have no alternative because the PSB is becoming really small and not important in terms of offering any kind of resistance to Bolsonarism.
Could I ask you a question? But, the fact that Lula chose Alckmin as his running mate, and he's from PSD, right?
Yes.
Do you think that would open up, I know that it has created a kind of chasm in the party, but could that be a way of, approximating these two groups? Approximating these two groups?
Yes, but the fact that Alckmin is running as vice president is like a symptom that how PSDB is
Subordinate,
yeah, exactly.
I think.
I just have a very simple question. What exactly is the relationship of the diaspora to outcomes of is it for example, I can say for comparison, in UK you have overseas friends of Egypt, and they actually send volunteers, like 2,000 people will go to the next so are there connections of that kind? What is the relationship with diaspora, position to the diaspora and
I was reading about this 2 days ago, that the number of Brazilian expatriate voters is smaller than the number of voters in the state of Tocantins, which is the fourth smallest electoral area, state in the country. So so there are a lot more voters in Brazil than there are outside, if I'm answering your question correctly. But I think the significance of those of us who are here and who vote outside of the United States is that, outside of Brazil, sorry, is that in Brazil, we pay attention to everything that happens outside of Brazil, right? So if, whatever result takes place here, I think reflects on Brazil. It's like, oh, see, it's, as in 2018, it's spreading, like the way he won, overwhelmingly outside of Brazil and, like 90%, for example, in Miami. So people, I see how important this is, how important he is. If I heard you correctly.
you give me very good information, but I was asking slightly different questions, so not about voters. So there are there's the Indian voters who live in other parts of the world, but I was talking about others who are not voters, who are Brazilians who are American citizens maybe. But and what do they do? Do they in any way influence elections?
So we, like,
May I?
right, we have a lot of persons.
Forgive me, I'm not on the panel, but I'm gonna take the liberty since I work on this stuff too, if I may. I think a lot of the Brazilian right, some of the key figures are or have been based in the United States. So there's a lot of, like, for instance, the Olavo de Carvalho, who recently died, who is the big so-called guru of Bolsonaro, lived in, I guess, rural Virginia. And, when Bolsonaro came to office, it was one of Olavo's books in hand. And actually a number of the kind of key right-wing, influencers, I hesitate to say intellectuals, live in Miami or thereabouts, and absorb a lot of, of some of the dynamics that were being described wonderfully by Isabela and Vânia, a lot of kind of right-wing motifs in the United States and kind of translate them for a Brazilian audience. So in that sense, there's, I think, a very direct kind of connection. I don't know if that was exactly the question. And forgive me for kind of breaking protocol.
Hi, This question is for you too. If we have the scenario that Bolsonaro loses the election, how high do you see the risk of serious social unrest?
I think that everybody has been talking about it. There is a possibility, right? I don't know how probable that is because he does not have the support of the military, most of the military. The military doesn't want to be like run Brazil again. And so although he has, rested in, parts of the military police and some branches of the armed forces, overall, there isn't that support. Now, gun ownership has increased in the 4 years that he's been in power because he opened up, he eased the law for people to acquire guns. And, in 2018 and this year also, there has been an increase in political violence. So it's possible. I like to say that we social scientists do not have a crystal ball, so I'm gonna say it's possible, but I don't know how probable, and I hope that there isn't such, an insurgency, because there is a very high level of intolerance that people, just talking to each other, but they start fighting and attacking each other, which, can easily lead to physical violence.
I'm not sure if I understood if you were talking about a coup or some kind of insurgents like from by civilians. But I agree with Vânia, a coup is very unlikely. But
It's unlikely.
Unlikely. But it not necessarily it means that I'm presenting an optimistic perspective, because Bolsonaro probably will try something that is not like institutional or using armed forces, but he will use militias, paramilitaries groups, radical groups in order to build his army, let's say like that. And it's really complicated, especially in the cities like Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo. It means they would use violence, not necessarily institutional violence, because Bolsonaro implemented some kind of policy that gave permission to, it's really unrealistic, but one specifically special, how do you know that? That a permission that every, one person can have 60 guns at home, just for, the tax. Okay, there's a specific permission. So why a regular person, just for fun, can have 60 guns inside home? So maybe some people that is looking at this these topics deeply are saying that it's a way to have these militias and use violence, not like institutional way, but in informal way, let's say like that.
So you discard the potential military reaction if Mr. Bolsonaro loses. However, Bolsonaro is a very good student of Mr. Trump, and he may do something about it. He may do a concerted effort to have a people's reaction nationwide.
I'm not saying it's impossible because we don't know, but it's unlikely because the militaries, they are in power with or without Bolsonaro. Let's say if there is a project to get militaries back in power, they achieved it. So maybe they don't need Bolsonaro anymore, maybe. So, because they're still in power, and it will be really hard to take them, from the, federal administration, even having Lula as president.
Thank you.
And then if there is an insurgency, he may always turn around and say, what do I have to do with this? That's, as it happened this weekend, when, an ally of his was supposed to be, sent to prison again. He was in, home arrest, and, he attacked one of the members of the Supreme Court, called her a prostitute, and then 3 days later said that she was worse than prostitutes. He apologized to prostitutes. His name is Roberto Jefferson, and her name is Carmen Lucia, and he was to be sent back to jail because he had violated the terms of his home arrest, which was to not post on social media. He did. He posted on his daughter's social media, and so the Supreme Court ordered his arrest, and he received the federal police with hand grenades, and he shot 50 shots at their cars, and then and he kept saying, "I'm a friend of the president," and Bolsonaro was like, "I have nothing to do with this." So if people start attacking each other on the street, a lot of apocalypse, it may very well, which is not uncommon, right? Because during the pandemic, it said all of that. Well, what do you want me to do? My name is Messiah, but I'm not God. Well, I'm not an undertaker, so what do you want me to do with all the dead? Oh, stop being gay. And yeah, he actually said that. And when are we going to stop being a country of gays and stop being so concerned with this little code, gripezinha? And he also imitated people who were suffocating, who were dying for lack of. I kept been laughing, and now recently in the debate, well, I may have said that I made mistakes, but people change. So if people attack each other on the street, or what? I didn't put a gun in their hand. What do I have to do with it?
This question is for Audrey. I'm really interested in your talk, and I'm particularly interested in Yankee Hundupa, and the example that you started out with, the bulldozer in Edison, New Jersey. For those of you who don't know, Edison is on the border of Rutgers University, New Brunswick. So this is an issue very close to home. And my question is, we talk about Hindu nationalism in the context of India, but this is New Jersey. And I'm wondering, what is the end game of the sort of Yankee Hindupa in New Jersey? Given that you said, the bulldozer is a sign akin to a swastika for Muslim Indians, but you also said that the people who deployed it might have been expecting that the American audience didn't recognize what it meant. So then what's the end game of it? Is it to bolster Indian sort of an Indian nativism, or does it have repercussions in the United States? Because of course you linked Hinduism with white supremacy here. So again, it sort of connects to the question earlier regarding Brazil and the diaspora's relationship to it. What's the end game for Yankee Hinduism in the United States?
So thank you for that question. So the short answer, I think the end game for the bulldozer was to normalize it so that when worse things happen in the future, the Hindu right can say, oh, we have this whole history, no one ever said anything before. But let me back up and give a little bit more context. So Hindu nationalism has been part of American social life for about half a century, about 50 years. Okay, it was in the 1970s that we saw the first Hindu nationalist groups form and incorporate in the US. And they modeled themselves on Hindu nationalist groups in India In some cases, the Indian groups actually sent people here to actually form them, okay? We refer to the coalition of Hindu nationalist groups as the Sangh Parivar, okay, the family of the RSS. The RSS is the paramilitary group in India that's sort of at the center of it all. And the Sangh Parivar structure is essentially identical in India and in the United States. So they have the RSS, we have the HSS here. They have the VHP that oversees religious affairs. We have the VHPA and so forth, okay? Now, as I see it, the Sangh Parivar, this coalition of Hindu nationalist groups, they have a bunch of goals in the US, and I tend to group them into two big categories. Goals that are more focused on stuff going on at home in India, and then goals that are more specific to the United States. So their goals vis-a-vis India include a big one that, full disclosure, Hindu nationalist groups hate it when I talk about this. They're very sensitive about this, but a big one is fundraising. Okay, millions of US dollars are sent back to India to support Hindu nationalist activities there through various mechanisms. Indian Americans are a notably wealthy minority group, owing essentially to US policies that limit migration from South Asia to skilled migration. So that's focused on India. There are also groups that provide other kinds of support, right? So I mean, I just mentioned this, right? We have Overseas Friends of the BJP, which is a registered foreign agent in the United States. They fundraise, they also get people, like actual people, to then fly to India and campaign on the ground for the BJP. So those are some of their goals vis-a-vis India. But there's also a set of Hindu nationalist goals that are specific to the United States. The biggest one is to normalize Hindu nationalism here, okay? And that's part of why Hindu nationalists attack scholars, is that we make it harder for them to normalize Hindu nationalism because we accurately describe it as an extremist, violent, fascist ideology. Other goals, one big one, and this also connects to the bulldozer, a big Hindu nationalist goal in the US is to whitewash the crimes of Hindu nationalists in India, the BJP and the RSS, which work pretty closely together in India these days. That is a job that is becoming harder every hour, as I see it. Yes. Okay, and folks, for those of you who do not follow the news related to India, it is bleak. Okay, Hindu nationalist violence is an everyday affair. I mentioned bulldozing the homes of Indian Muslims, but that's just the beginning. Okay, they lynch Muslims on the streets in India for eating beef, or even if they think that they're eating beef. There are attacks on human rights activists. Amnesty International can no longer even operate in India. Hundreds of NGOs that provide various social services, food to the poor, that sort of thing, have been shut down under Modi. Things are looking bad. Okay, genocide experts began their warnings at the beginning of this year, of 2022. That India is real close to a genocide against Indian Muslims. So coming to the Hindu right diaspora here, who is pro-Modi and pro the BJP, how do you possibly whitewash these accelerating violent crimes, right? It's a hard sell, and in order to do it, I think that the Hindu right in the US has to become more and more bold, right? There's simply no other way. So you have to get people used to it. You have to get people used to seeing bulldozers and, sort of see if you can get less informed members of the American public to buy Hindu right mythologies and their incorrect explanations and factually false allegations, right? So I think it's a sort of normalization and whitewashing. The last thing I'll mention, this is not specific to the bulldozer, but it is a key part of Hindu nationalist activities in the US is controlling the narrative around both India and Hinduism, right? And that's where the attacks on scholars are sort of at the forefront.
Unfortunately, we're out of time for this session. I just want to thank again our wonderful panelists, Doctors Audrey Truschke, Isabela Kalil, and Vânia Penha-Lopes, for their really thoughtful and fascinating presentations. I encourage you all to stick around. We've got lunch, and at 1 o'clock, we're going to have the next session, politics across borders or something like that. And then that will be at 1 to 2:30. What is it? Thank you. Immigrant communities and global politics. I have my computer to read it off, but I don't have it in hand. And then, finally, we're gonna have a really interesting panel at 3, reflections by organizers, with some of the organizers from the Brazilian community who've been doing, all kinds of, very, very important work organizing in those communities. So please stick around, have some lunch, and, yeah, enjoy.